We wanted to take the opportunity to really have a lively talk and discussion about how to look at dementia differently. As you know, we are trying to use the word forgetfulness and are trying to really have a different viewpoint on this whole phenomenon called Alzheimer's dementia. That's one. But then also the associated behaviors, which are now going to be addressed from a Guru Project point of view. Meaning we actually want to try to understand what is behind behaviors. Maybe we can just have Richard start, and then Al. Al has written a couple books on dementia beyond drugs and dementia beyond disease, and Richard also wrote a book that I have here called Alzheimer's from the Inside Out. So they have written about their passion, their experience, and we are privileged to hear them. So, yeah, you're welcome. So maybe Richard, you want to take it?
Okay. Well, it's a wonderful feeling to be in a room with so many psychologists. Many people would be threatened by this, but my name is Richard Taylor. I've been diagnosed with dementia, probably the Alzheimer's type. I've lived with modest symptoms for about 8 years now. But I'm a member of the community of people who have been diagnosed with some form or another of dementia. And I've always personally been very disappointed in the response of the psychology community to older people, and especially to people with dementia. When I was diagnosed, the APA was having a commission on what are going to be the next 5 big issues for psychology in the next 25 years, first 25 years of the next century. And I flew to Washington to testify, and the conclusion they drew was the first thing they thought was the big issue was psychologists participating in torture. And they completely ignored the tsunami of people who will be living with the symptoms of dementia in the United States. And at least when I did my schooling a million years ago, nobody mentioned dementia, nobody mentioned altered states of mind, other than LSD and a few other hallucinatory drugs. And when I saw what the title of this was, about behavior, what dawned on me is that, you know, we've all lived with the mantra behavior means something. It's a symbol. It represents some state of being inside the person. And when you don't have not a clue of what's the state inside the person, what do you do when you're called in and asked to analyze why they're behaving this way? Well, what you do is you just replace my feeling, my motivation, with your own. This is what behavior means. You're acting up, you're angry. That's what we usually end up being labeled in some disruptive behavior to the social process that we're living in. And I believe that for people with dementia, I don't think that they change their basic personality structure, but I think they become very afraid and very frustrated. And I think that's what motivates a good deal of what you would term acting out behaviors. But that's not how you look at them, especially you Skinnerians. You're so busy looking at the antecedent and what happened before and what happened afterwards, and trying to find, and then trying to interpret the behavior based on those little snapshots that you have. You miss the forest for the tree. And the tree is that I have dementia. Now the problem for psychologists is we don't have psychological theories that adapt well to someone living with an altered mind, a mind that processes information differently than your minds do. And so we always live in the shadow of your interpretation of our behavior because we have trouble expressing ourselves. And we can't tell you exactly what's going on inside our minds because our minds actually don't know, I believe. It's an altered state of being, is essentially what happens with people with dementia. It's not irrational. The brain tries to organize it irrationally. It's not without meaning. But the meaning, I believe, oftentimes is I'm afraid, I don't understand, I'm frustrated. It doesn't mean that I'm turning mean. And that's what we get labeled with when we have problem behaviors, when we start acting out. I don't know, he's never been mean before. But whose definition of the behavior is meanness, yours or mine? Do you think I did it because I've actually turned mean? Or do you think I'm doing it out of frustration? It's my way of communicating to you. And the way my mind works, I think, is over time, and I can feel that now, I'm less and less motivated by the rational side of my mind and more by the emotional side of my mind. And those emotions in people with dementia, I believe, bounce around in their minds all the time because they can't attach themselves to actual incidents because they can't recall those accurately. So they live in a feeling world. And when you're rational and you're living with someone who's feeling, you'll probably get divorced. Well, we can't divorce ourselves from the world. That's how we live. And so I think what happens to us is, since we realize we're not fitting in, is we start to try to bury our feelings, not show them to people. And so there's nothing left of us to show. We don't have a rational side. And we don't have a feeling side that we want people to have access to because we're a little embarrassed that it feels out of control. Sometimes it's inappropriate and people tell us to stop showing you're feeling that way. Stop crying, stop hitting, stop being loud, whatever it is. And we all should be turning to psychologists that understand this, to figure us out. You know, psychology, when I was in school, was psychology. Now it's biology and psychology. Now it's philosophy and psychology. Now it's all three of them blended together. And I think that's a good thing. I see that as we're moving in the right direction. But we're just not moving it with people with dementia. And since, I don't know what year it's supposed to be, 2030 or something like that, the world will be divided into two groups of people. Those who have dementia and those who have intimate contact with somebody who has dementia. It's the defining psychological state, altered psychological state of the next 50 years. But I don't see or feel from psychology that we got to get up and running on this because it's coming. In fact, it's here. So whenever I get to talk to psychologists, I always say, it's here, we're here. If you're looking for the next market, it's going to be older people. If you're looking for the next career to build, it's going to be in dealing with older people's psychological states and how to, as a psychologist, how to help people find a healthy way of expressing their humanity without getting arrested or thrown into an Alzheimer's unit. Now, for me personally, I believe that Alzheimer's is probably a function of growing old. I don't think it's a disease. It's what happens when our brain, which aged very well until we were 35 or 40, started to age differently. And it's understandable why our brains do that, because they just haven't evolved for us to live twice as long as our great-great-grandfathers did. So we're stuck with this aging brain that doesn't work as well as it should be working. But we also have prostates that are too big. We also have kidneys that aren't working well. We also have livers that got things growing on them and in them. I mean, all of our organs are aging beyond their warranty period. We can replace all of our organs or fix all of our organs, except for the brain. And the brain, we turn to talkers like you folks. Hopefully we turn away from the druggers like psychiatrists. But what do you got to talk about? What do you have as a construct, a theory? What do you think when you see someone who's in their 70s or 80s and is not as verbal as you are, or doesn't have the attention span that you are, or repeatedly asks you the same question over and over and over again? How do you deal with that as a psychologist? What does that behavior mean when somebody asks you the same question over and over again? This is where you move your lips.
Forgetfulness.
Pardon?
Forgetfulness.
Means, yes, I believe that. It means I already forgot I asked you the question. Mm-hmm. How do people respond to repeated questions?
Get angry.
They get angry. I already told you that. And it's not important. It's none of your business. Yes, we do. Well, how do you think people with dementia respond to that?
Shame.
They get embarrassed. That's right. That's right. My family for a while used to tell me how many times I'd asked the same question. Well, you know, that's the 5th time you've asked me that question. Like I'm trying to piss them off. But I'm not. I just can't recall that I asked it. That's important to me. Well, hopefully you all have that understanding. Hopefully you all are supportive of me. My family and I worked it out where if I asked them something over and over again, they would write it down on a little piece of paper. And they'd say, here, we know that this answer is important to you. Where are we going? What are we going to do? Whatever the question was. And I keep it in my pocket. And so when a question in my mind would come up, I'd reach in, I have these handful of sticky Post-it notes, and I'd go through them to see if I could find an answer in it. That's the kind of thing psychologists have to understand and do, I believe, is provide creative solutions to the shortcomings, the cognitive shortcomings of people with dementia. And you are the ones who are going to come up with that. You are the ones who are going to see us for an hour and have trouble carrying on conversations with us for that long. And it's one of the reasons I speak out, because I'm going to be one of those people. And I think I have an obligation to my profession to speak out about things that I think are affecting my profession, because I still think I'm a pretty good psychologist. I just get things mixed up once in a while. when I was diagnosed, I closed my practice. I just gave it to my best friend because I didn't think it was appropriate. It's not that I couldn't remember people's names, at least I thought that, or I got things mixed up. But I did once in a while, and I thought it was too big a risk, both professionally and ethically and financially, to address his problems while I was talking to you. But I know psychologists who continue to see people when they've been diagnosed with dementia. Because in some people it moves very fast, and in other people it moves very slow. And I think psychologists are blessed because most of us have gone to school longer than any human being should go to school. Most of us are extroverts or low-scoring eyes on Myers-Briggs. Most of us have pretty big vocabularies. Psychology builds your vocabulary, I think. And those are 3 skills that help you cover up your symptoms of dementia. If you have a big vocabulary and you're beginning to forget words, no one will know it because you've got another word that nobody understands that you can substitute for the word that you can't think of. If you get confused, people assume that because Dr. Taylor said something, it must have meaning, and so they take the responsibility to figure out what the hell I'm trying to say. And unfortunately, other people who don't have doctor before or after their name don't get that kind of treatment. And they call it in dementia research cognitive reserves. You all have cognitive reserves. So you won't show your symptoms of dementia till later in life if you end up with dementia. And it'll be a slow progression. It's not that you're physically changing what's happening in your brain, it's just that you've altered the way you communicate and you're covering it up better than other people cover it up. So that's what I got to say about psychology.
I'll just say a few words too. This is kind of a different group than what we've had, which is really nice. And I don't know if any of you have heard me speak before, but rather than kind of go back to the beginning like I've done with the other groups, I'm just going to skip ahead to like chapter 27, because I think with this group we can explore some different areas. We don't have to necessarily lay all the groundwork. And so I want to talk about some things that I haven't talked about this week. Even if you haven't heard me, I bore myself if I say the same things over and over again. So I want to talk, first of all, a little bit about terminology. Because Nader started out the session by talking about the fact that he's been trying to get away from the word dementia here. You know probably the American Psychiatric Association has dropped it from the DSM-5 because they feel the language is stigmatized. And I'll tell you, if the American Psychiatry Association feels language is stigmatized, it really is. because they've been known to use some of this terminology in the past. And so if a word bothers them, we probably should all pay attention. Unfortunately, major and minor neurocognitive disorders does seem a lot better to me than dementia. So I'm not sure what to do. I like forgetfulness. Not everybody likes forgetfulness. I use the word dementia in the title of my 2 books because I'm trying to reach across the bridge to people who know that word. If I write forgetfulness beyond disease, then maybe somebody out there in the bookstore won't realize I could be talking about Alzheimer's. So I'm trying to bring people in. But I think language is important because language really, you know, it's this, all this neurolinguistic programming. But the words we choose help frame our worldview, frame our thoughts. And so it's really important. My latest, I keep trying to come up with other expressions. My latest one is I like saying people who are of a different mind. I kind of like that, you know. So there's another way to look at it. When I wrote my first book, Dementia Beyond Drugs, I redefined dementia early on in the book because I believe that the stigmas around the language we use, behavior problems, acting out, those types of things are so powerful that it makes it very difficult for us to see new solutions when we hem ourselves in with such judgmental and kind of narrow views. And so I define dementia as a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. And I like it because it's not judgmental. It just says that I'm not experiencing the world the way I did. And I think that's what Richard said at the beginning. I think I said in the first book that sometimes, and I think this still makes some sense, I said this a few years ago, that it's like living in a parallel universe. You have the same space and time, but the rules are a little bit different for you than maybe the people around you. And you have to, as Richard said, find ways to connect, find ways to understand how to relate to the people who are not processing things the way you do. And so I've moved away from a lot of those terms that label the actions and expressions of people in ways like behavior problems or things that really judge the person, that blame the person for what is going on. So I'll start with that. And you know, I've even moved away from the word behavior. Now, if you read a book or see a film on animal behavior or you talk about people's behavior, it's not a good or a bad word. If I'm hungry and I go to the refrigerator and open it and get a sandwich out, that's a behavior, right? I'm responding to something and there's a stimulus and response and I'm doing it. But unfortunately, I think there's become such a pejorative around the word behavior in our society. We're always telling children to control your behavior as if the only thing that is out there is bad, that's why you have to control it. And I think that I would wager that when you talk about a person living with any of these cognitive changes, that whenever you use the word behavior, it is always in a negative sense. You are rarely talking about the wonderful thing that Richard did today when you talk about his behavior. So we have got a very stigmatized word right there that I've tried to get away from. People talk about personal expressions. I kind of like that term. I talk about people's comments and actions, just to try to describe, not to pretend that people don't say or do things, but to say it in the most neutral terms possible so that we can have an open mind about what that might be. So that's one of the things I've tried to do. Now, once again, because you're the advanced group, I'm going to take it even farther, because one of the most enlightened things that we talk about in these so-called person-centered approaches are what they call the needs-based dementia compromise behavior model, which basically says that when people are distressed or when they have certain actions or expressions, it's often the result of unmet needs, and we need to find those unmet needs. And much of the time that's true, and a lot of my books talk about how you might find unmet needs. But I've realized in recent months and years that even that is not a complete enough view, because we often do things that are not due to unmet needs. If I'm driving to work, I might just decide to drive a different way. Or I might be at a party where there's a lot going on, a picnic party, and just walk away from the crowd and just go stand out by the trees in the back in the silence for a few minutes and just kind of enjoy the solitude. You know, these are not unmet needs, really. They're just me expressing curiosity or agency or desire for aesthetic enjoyment. And unfortunately, when you have that label of Alzheimer's, everything you do gets pathologized if you just look at things as unmet needs. So Richard wants to go outside because he has a behavior, he has an unmet need. Well, maybe Richard's just curious about what's on the other side of the door. That's not a problem. That's a human expression that we all have, but we pathologize it. So we even have to go bigger than saying unmet needs. We have to say, what is the expression? And how do we help this person to express themselves and to find whatever it is that they're seeking? So I've been using a framework, as I've talked about, of well-being, creating well-being as a way of looking at how we can best serve people whose cognition is changing. And I use can I do a little thing here, Smith?
Yes, thank you.
I use a little Maslow-type pyramid. I'll just share that with you. But it's Alslow, not Maslow. And I use a model that a group of nursing home culture change people developed. And they came up with 7 domains of well-being, and I rearranged them and put them in the pyramid. And the 7 domains that I work with, which are just one form, there are many models, but this is one I can understand and teach, are identity and connectedness, security, autonomy, and I apologize for writing like a doctor, can't help that, that's why I went to med school, because I got bad handwriting scores, meaning, growth, and at the very top I put the word joy. Now you can arrange these any way you want, but I'll explain why I do this. So these are 7 domains, and the nice thing about this model, like many well-being models, is that these are fairly universal across ages, across cultures. across abilities, health and illness. And the other great thing about this model, some models, like for instance Kipwood's indicators of well-being, talked about things like ability to initiate social engagement. Well, that's something you have to be able to do. Now, if you live with Alzheimer's and you can't initiate engagement, does that mean you can't have well-being? By his model, you kind of fall short there. One thing I love about this model is that this has nothing to do with your physical health, your cognitive status, or your functional status. Anybody, you can have inoperable cancer, you can have Alzheimer's. We should be able to help optimize these 7 aspects in everybody. So identity is about personhood, connectedness is about relationship, belonging, even connections to the invisible. Security. Now, Maslow put safety on the bottom. I didn't put this on the bottom because this is more than just having food and shelter, like Maslow talked about. This is about also emotional security, trust, familiarity, dignity, respect. And you can't bring that to a person if you don't know them and have a meaningful relationship. How can a stranger make you feel trusting and familiar? And so I'm really talking about using this pyramid as a way to help enhance or restore well-being in people who live with cognitive change. And so if you're doing that, this is really the base. You have to know the person and you have to have as meaningful a relationship as you can. Now, they may not remember your name, but there has to be that continuity. There has to be that, at least that emotional, subconscious familiarity if people are going to feel trusting. And it gets into all the other things, body language and communication style and all that. And then security, autonomy. When someone feels safe, they can exercise choice. And when you know them well, you can help them negotiate risk to continue to exercise choice in the safest way possible. And when you can exercise choice, that's when you get meaning in your life. And the one thing we do as activity professionals that is a problem is providing failure-free activities for people. Failure-free activities are meaningless. If I gave you a crossword puzzle, say, okay, we've got 1 square, give me a letter of the alphabet, any letter you want, you yell out B and I put it up there and say, great, you solved the puzzle, wasn't that fun? You want to do it again? No, there's no risk. If there's no risk of doing something wrong, there's no reward to doing it right. So meaning and growth come when we can make choices and we can negotiate risk to actually accomplish something that gives us purpose. And so we don't like, I don't personally like fake activities. I like activities that, that provide a visible purpose. So instead of giving you a basket of laundry to fold and then messing it up and bringing it back to you, I'd have you fold the napkins for the dinner table that everybody's going to use, or clear the table. Do things that provide visible meaning, and whatever, you know, within your abilities and desires. And then at the top, joy. I just see everything as a path to joy, and vice versa. So the nice thing about this is that if there is an unmet need, you can tie it into erosion of one or more of these domains of well-being. And by working on these, you have a proactive, strength-based approach. Whereas most of our responses to people's personal expressions are deficit-based, reactive approaches. Fix the behavior instead of create the positive infrastructure for daily well-being. And that's why even our non-pharmacologic interventions only last a short time, and then we walk away and the next day it happens again, because all they are short-term, they're like pills. They're short-term reactive interventions that don't understand the person or try to meet these larger domains. The nice thing is, though, if a person's expressing something that is not an unmet need, curiosity, aesthetics, agency, this doesn't try to correct it. This just provides an environment where the person can optimize those expressions too. So it doesn't try to judge what the person's doing. It just tries to create the best environment for the person. One other bit of terminology I want to give you, if I can remember what it was, because things fly out of my head too when I get going like this. One thing maybe we'll get into, because we have a good group to do this with, and I won't do it right now, but we can maybe as we go into it. My seeing the world this way and trying to understand the things that people like Richard and others have taught me is to come up with some very unusual interpretations of things that we as professionals tend to label. So I personally believe that the vast majority of things we call hallucinations and delusions in dementia are incorrectly applied. And I have an interesting way I've come up with recently of looking at that we can go into. I've learned some things about how you can understand something that doesn't make sense to you when you realize, as Richard says, that people who have less access to facts and memories operate on more of an emotional or symbolic plane, and why we constantly miss people in our communication. So I've been able to come up with some insights based on those things. And I'll just give you a quick story based on that, and then we can get into the other stuff later. Richard talked once about saying, if I call you mom or dad, I may not be confusing with my mom or dad. I know they're dead, but I miss them, and I associate the feelings I have with them with you, and sometimes the images just get mixed up, and I don't try to sort them out, because maybe you're my son, but I'm associating my feeling with you with my father, and so that's the way it comes out. Whereas, you know, the normal person might say, oh, Dad's lost it, he's gone, because he thinks I'm his father instead of his son. So this is looking at the emotions and the feelings associated with it. Christine Bryden, who lives with dementia in Australia, was diagnosed at age 46, and now 20 years since she was diagnosed this year. Also standing up and speaking out like Richard, wrote a book in which she said that she believes people are making an important journey from cognition into emotion, and then maybe at the end of their lives into spiritual beings. And once again, that resonated with what Richard said about this emotional plane. And so I was explaining to a group in Alaska several years ago that what that meant to me was that when people say something, we get stuck on the facts of the expression. So someone says, have you seen my mother? And the person's 90 years old. And we get stuck between that difficult, we have two choices. We can either tell the truth and upset them by saying your mother's dead, or we can tell the little white lie, oh, your mother went to the store, she'll be back after dinner, and then that blows up in our face, and because she doesn't show up, and the person remembers we said that, and then we've lost trust. Well, to me, the answer is you don't do either one. The first thing you do is you always connect, validate the emotion the person's expressing, and as psychologists, you know better than I, give them a chance to express it, sit with that, and then talk about that person to find out what's really being represented symbolically. What does mother represent? And when you understand the meaning behind the expression, not the actual words, then you can sometimes, you can't provide that woman to her, but you can provide those things maybe that she was giving her in a regular way, so that those things that she's asking for symbolically can be provided in other ways. I was in Alaska, and I was giving an afternoon talk at an assisted living like this, and there were family members and elders and staff, and we had a potluck dinner, and then we had a social hour. And during the social hour, a woman came up to me and she said, that story you told helped me solve a problem I've been having with my mother. And so I asked her to tell me, and she said, my mother moved in here a few weeks ago. She's very forgetful. And I come in usually at night after work and see her, and when it's time to leave, I say, I'm going now, good night. And as soon as I say good night, she gets concerned, and she says, where are you going to sleep? And up to this point, I've been saying, well, I'm going home, of course. I'm going to sleep in my bed. And as soon as I say that, she gets all upset. She starts missing her home and missing her husband and wanting to leave, and the tears flow. And she said, I was at the point where I was going to cut down my visits because I couldn't deal with this separation every night. And so she thought about that, and she said, you know, I've been living in the first world of logic, facts, memory, and so I've been answering her question, where are you going to sleep? So I asked myself tonight, what is she really asking me? And I decided that she's my mother. She's still my mother. She cares about my safety, my happiness, my well-being. That's what she's asking me. So I took her back after dinner, put her in her room, and I said good night, and she said, where are you going to sleep? And I said, Mom, I have the best place to sleep. I've got a good book from the library, and I'm going to make a cup of tea and curl up on a big bed and have a wonderful night. And her mother smiled and said good night, and she walked out the door. So once again, when you get inside and try to understand the perspective from, as Richard says, understand what the person's feeling instead of our interpretation of what they're feeling, you have a lot better chance of getting into that. So I'm going to stop there and go back to Nader. And I just want to make a comment, too, about something Richard said. You know, it's too bad we have the regulatory and liability system we have, because in my mind, many people who are early into this journey with cognitive change would be superb psychoanalysts, because they have the ability to be present in the moment and to not only hear the words, but hear what's behind the words, better than the rest of us do with our kind of, you know, multitasking brains. And I don't know, I've seen that with Richard when we talk to people, and I try to answer the questions, and then Richard answers with a much deeper, nuanced answer than I give. I'm all for having people in practice who've got a touch of Alzheimer's, because I think you could get a lot out of it personally.
So I just wanted to make sure, because I think your story of the daughter who listened differently to the mother is really an important, important description of really what you're trying to do. Meaning, you're trying to get away from the literal, right? Where are you going? Oh, I'm going home. Oh my goodness. to what she really wanted to know is that her daughter was going to be safe and had a good night's sleep, and it wasn't about going somewhere else. It was about the safety, right? That really was, so the emotional reality was important to the mother, and the daughter picked that up. So the whole journey, what we talk about in our existential humanistic psychotherapy is a lot, how do we not do therapy in such a cerebral way? Because I like to quote an author's last book title, which is Psychotherapy is Not What You Think, right? So it's actually not a cognition, but rather it is emotion, because we live in our subjective self. So change happens in our subjective self. It doesn't happen by me telling you, well, Richard, all you have to do is just don't worry so much anymore, right? And then that's not going to help. Would we all agree that it's not going to help Richard or anybody? You can't just say intellectually, just don't do that anymore, right? I fret, I'm depressed. Oh yeah, please don't be depressed anymore. There's no reason for you to be depressed. I mean, that's not going to do anything. We all know that. It's funny, but we all know that. Yet therapy and emotional connection often is being seen in the therapeutic profession from an intellectual point of view. Psychoanalysis is often about interpretation, right? So exactly, just cementing your point, both of your point, being able to live much more in the emotion is actually what the gift could be of people who are forgetful to us, who are often much more cerebral. We often are so, you have heard me say that, hypercognitive. Hypercognitive is we judge each other by how quickly do we talk, what's our vocabulary, can you do 1 and 1 is 2, etc. I mean, just all that cognition. So when then somebody is here and is kind of talking more slowly, you know, listens more, we sometimes think, or we might think, I don't know about you, well, maybe this person is from the countryside, right? Or maybe not that educated, right? Or because it doesn't seem like that person is engaged, you know, on our intellectual level, right? But yet, the big timeless wisdom traditions always say what?
Silence is golden.
Silence is golden. And they actually talk about wisdom expresses itself much more in the ability to listen than to talk. So in some ways, and Richard hasn't been buying my argument yet, but I have a few more days. I've been trying to tell him what is right about it, right? I want to really ideally reframe what he still calls dementia. I have a few more days to work on it. As actually something that is a gift to the rest of us who are running around in their heads and often don't sink down to a more emotional level. And people like Richard can allow us, afford us, to come down and actually maybe be quiet for a moment and actually feel what is happening with ourselves. How many of us do that? 1, 1.5.
Not often enough.
Not often enough, right? To actually, especially these days with all of our nice techno devices where we're constantly on and it's vibrating here and there and this and that, right? So we're constantly on, and having the ability to drop down if somebody says, hey, let's just take a moment. And I know when we are more experienced as therapists, we often know that through just experience that just talking doesn't really do much. It needs to be connected. It needs to have a center. And so I think that's the gift that Richard can bring to us. And what does Richard say?
This is the point where your lips should be.
Yeah, right. I never would have gotten my PhD if I followed your advice.
That's true.
I believe that our brains are pretty comfortable in our heads most of the time because had hundreds of years to evolve, and they're at a point where they're in balance, sort of. Don't worry, not completely. There's still room for us in it. And people with dementia, their brains are physically flawed. Somebody's ripped some connections out or put new programs in there, or however you want to see your brain. And because of that, our brains run faster and longer than most people's brains. That's why we're tired, more tired than most people, I believe. Because of that, because the intellectual side, the verbal side of our brain is, we can't be as dependent on it or not. Feelings begin to define more and more of our experience. And because then they float around or bounce around in our head, because feelings are much more difficult. You can't tell somebody to stop feeling depressed. You can tell them to stop thinking about your wife, your ex-wife, but you can't tell them. Those feelings are there long after whatever triggered those feelings. And pretty soon, I think, as we get deeper into the symptoms of dementia, we are creatures of feelings rather than creatures of verbal, intellectual processing. And it's very hard for other people to understand us then. And I believe that our brain is still trying to go back to what's worked for it for a couple thousand years now, to be more rational. And so we don't talk as much because we can't express ourselves the way we used to express ourselves, and that's embarrassing and frustrating to us. And over time, we stop thinking about things as much. They don't bother us, so we don't understand the world. We just sit in our wheelchairs quietly by the nurse's station, and we just, you know, our day is, a good day is when somebody walks by and says, "Hi, Richard," and I say hi back to him. And then I go back into my, wherever I'm going back into. And I make sure nobody knows where I am. Because when I start expressing feelings is when they bring the drugs or the restraints, or I don't get to sit out here, I have to go back to my room. The argument that this is or the position or understanding that this is a blessing to you all, I am a blessing to you all, it doesn't carry as much weight as it would have if I thought that my life was I was gonna teach until I was 85. That was my dream, was to teach till I was 85. Okay. Now it turns out that I can be wise until I'm 85, but I can't teach until I'm 85.
You're doing it now.
Yeah. And I don't know why I'm hesitant to say whoopee, you know. I mourn the loss of my abilities. People don't see the loss of my abilities, but they're there. I just cover them up better. I can talk around them rather than through them now. And I know I'm doing it. And I know in most cases people don't know that I'm doing it. But I can't stop myself from doing it. I was speaking somewhere, and I was staying in a hotel on the upper floor, and I was supposed to be downstairs at a certain time, and I got out, and it was one of those hotels where you can walk all the way around it, you know, the rooms go all in a circle. So I got out of my room and I walked to the elevators, but I couldn't see the lobby. So I thought, well, maybe there's 2 banks of elevators. So I walked all the way around again, and I was back to here. And then I started to get frustrated doing this. And I got to about here once, and people downstairs came up and got off the elevator to get me. And as they got me, without thinking, I said, "I'm sorry I'm late, I had trouble dressing." I mean, I covered it up without even thinking about it. And that scared me that I did that, because I think of myself as much more open than most people with dementia. But it's in me. I'm embarrassed by it. I'm scared about it. So because I can't get over mourning who I was, and you can't appreciate my mourning because you're not me, and I appreciate it differently now than I did before, it's hard for me to say, whoopee. I can see the value in it as a society, that we have people here that are more feeling oriented, more articulate and comfortable in expressing and talking about their feelings, and can see them in other people in ways that most of you out there can't see through the corn stalks. I just don't see the corn at all. Or I don't see the stalks. I can just see the corn. So that's why I'm resistant to say there's something good about living with dementia. Because,
Let me ask a question just for you to reflect off of, and that this brings up that I've struggled with, and that is that, society needs rules. Society needs a consensus reality for governments and communities to operate. And yet, when people fall outside those rules, the yardstick of normal is so powerful that it causes embarrassment, covering up, loss of self-esteem when you can't measure up to society's expectation. Now, I'm not promoting anarchy here, but what's the balance between having societal consensus and being flexible enough to, I think about a person in a wheelchair having ramps, instead of being told they have to walk up steps or being excluded because there are no ramps. So what's, how can we better find that balance between accommodating different views, not causing people to feel so bad about being different, but still have a functioning environment? I don't know the answer to that, but that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah, you're talking about what can we do to create a more forgetfulness-friendly world.
Yeah.
Right, just like we did for...
Or I use the word inclusive. Yeah, I don't like dementia
inclusive.
friendly, because friendly is, I like people with dementia, they're so cute,
Yeah.
So I like the word inclusive, but yeah, exactly.
Forgetfulness inclusive, because we're doing it with other so-called disabilities, right? We're including them more. So what would you say to that, Richard? What would be more inclusive for you?
well, we used to deal with it by moving to San Francisco.
Whatever you got here, it's worse out there, believe me.
Where it was a more inclusive world, and it was a more forgiving and tolerant and actually honoring world. I don't know if that holds true now or not, but and values have changed. I don't think people. What we do is we gather in the little like-minded communities. All the old people get together and move into one building, and all the yuppies or the millenniums or whatever they are, they move in and live in another building. And we begin to isolate ourselves from each other is what we're doing now.
Which is unfortunate.
Yes, I think it is. Very unfortunate.
That is a problem.
Or there was a time when we were building communities, and then we would have a little community over here where we put the old people, and they'd be close enough that we could walk over and visit them, but far enough that they wouldn't be in our business. We don't live in a community that sees the value in intergenerational things happening.
Yeah. And that's a recipe for failure with our aging society, that we're going to be in big trouble, because we only see older people as recipients of services for which somebody has to pay. We don't see that older people have anything to contribute to society, and so we do two things. Number one, we monetize aging and medicalize aging. And number two, we move people. Instead of creating inclusive communities, we leave our communities the way they are, and when people can't be independent anymore, we move them to the almighty CCRC, which not only deprives elders of their community, but deprives the community of the wisdom of those elders. And there's more ways to get back to community than just to hold down a paying job. And there's so many things that older people can do for us. But we are moving people away. But unfortunately, when you look at aging demographics, this model we're following is unsustainable. We're headed off a cliff. And if we don't change the paradigm seriously, we're going to be in trouble, because we will not have the people to build, staff, or maintain all those CCRCs with our aging demographics in 20 or 30 years. And it's going to be a disaster if we don't start accommodating that change in different ways. So, for instance, I work with a friend who's been doing some work in reintegrating elders in the community after the tsunami and earthquake that devastated parts of northern Japan. And some of the things going on up there, first of all, the older people, many of whom lost their lives, you know, over half the people who died in the tsunami were over 65 because they were less mobile. But they often saved their neighbors' lives by telling them where to go to get to high ground, because they lived through these things before. When northern Japan had this prolonged time without electricity or running water, they showed people how to preserve food, how to cook on traditional stoves, how to do things that younger people didn't know how to do. There are communities where older people who are homebound will provide after-school care for neighbors' children, and then the neighbors give them a ride to the store or the doctor's office. So there are many things you can do besides pay for services or hold down a paying job. But until we shift that perspective, our aging society is going to get us in trouble, because in 1950, there were approximately 12 working adults in the world for every retired adult. And in 2000, that dropped to 9 to 1, and in 2050, it's going to be 4 to 1. So we can't just build nursing homes. There's going to be no one to run them. Okay, that's not the answer, and our country can't seem to get there. Now, the other interesting thing about this, and once again, a lot of what I do is I like to look at the whole picture. So I'll give you 2 examples of the whole picture that we don't talk about. First of all, we talk about, you know, this aging tsunami, like all these people that are going to be frail and need services, and dementia. You know that the Alzheimer's Association has called my generation, the baby boomers, Generation Alzheimer's, because when we are old, there are going to be more people with Alzheimer's than there have ever been before on the planet. And that's true, but you know, the incidence of Alzheimer's is actually going down because of better cardiovascular and preventive health care. So actually, if you're 50 years old, your risk lifetime is less than a 60-year-old or a 70-year-old. So why are the numbers going up? Well, just because there's too damn many baby boomers getting old. 10,000 a day in the United States alone turning 65. So there are just going to be more old people, and a certain percentage of us are going to have Alzheimer's. But when you think about that, what does that also say? There are going to be more cognitively intact people, old people, than ever before. Why isn't the Alzheimer's Association calling us the cognitively intact generation? It's all about stigma. It's all about labeling. It's that narrow view. The other thing we never talk about is what happens after 2050. After 2050, we all start dying, and guess what? The pyramid's going to go back. The number of people with Alzheimer's is going to drop precipitously without any of the treatments, and we're going to have a much more balanced age society than we have right now. But nobody talks about that. So this is our challenge. If we can learn how to create an inclusive society today, then we can create a society that will get us through the future challenges in the late century: global warming, warfare, shortages, all the things we need to work on. But we're not seeing this as that opportunity. We're just seeing this as how do we further entrench ourselves in this medicalized system of aging. So that's a bigger thing. Totally outside the box, but it's all connected, because the stigmatization of Alzheimer's is only a microcosm of the stigmatization of aging in our society. And you can't address one without the other.
Beautifully said. Questions?
I'm waiting for it.
Yeah,
Yes.
there you go.
I was warned.
May I address a question to Dr. Taylor?
Absolutely.
Dr. Taylor, I really appreciated your commentary, and I'm curious why you believe psychologists and the field of psychology are neglecting to see the need that is inherent in the increasing older adult population.
Well, honestly, I think that one of the big reasons is it's financial. When Medicare and Medicaid pay $15 an hour for psychotherapy, the best psychologists can do is to put them in a group. And if I got 10 people in a group, then I'm making my $150 an hour. It's just not economically beneficial for psychologists to have a whole practice full of old people, even if that line is 5 times longer than the millennium line out there. it takes 5 times as many of them to produce the same income or revenue as one does. Secondly, because our profession is growing old, but reputations were made years ago. So we don't have a lot of elder icons that are champions of people their age in graduate school now. What we have is people who are hanging on to papers that they wrote 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, that was a different world, and there were different concerns of psychology. But there's this gap before we get people like you back into graduate school to change the curriculum so that you can be talking about issues that are germane to the biggest section of your population. I think that's a reason why we don't do it. Another reason is because it's not intellectually challenging to you folks, like dealing with a schizophrenic or a multiple personality or a family that's degenerating before your eyes. To take an old person or an older person who is exhibiting symptoms of dementia and help them build their self-esteem, rebuild their self-esteem or sense of self, or any of these values here that Al. So all those things are working against us and the profession. And there's nobody who's a change agent or a champion now to step up. Because unfortunately, where psychology is moving, it's becoming more medicalized or more scientific. And that's the interest of younger psychologists. But the area that they're interested in doesn't have any answers for dementia. Has very little science on thinking. There's not schools of thought of how you deal with thought when you have dementia. What would Carl Jung say about dementia? What would Albert Ellis say about dementia? You know, we don't have that a chapter in our textbooks or papers written about that. So there's this hole of knowledge here, but unfortunately everybody is falling into that hole, not the majority, but many more people are falling into that hole of psychological knowledge. And the hole is getting a little bit bigger because people are moving away from traditional answers, talk therapy, into these biomedical degrees that they, nobody gets a psychology degree anymore. They always have a word before it or a word after it and the word psychology. So it's not moving in the direction of addressing our issues, I don't think. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm kind of pinballing in my mind between something you said, Dr. Kelly, and something that you said, Dr. Taylor. So you were just saying how working with someone with dementia might not be intellectually challenging. And I think the whole point for us to, which people here are considering, is maybe it's not cerebrally challenging, but what does come from it is opening up another way of being, and being with somebody at a deeper level. And I think that's what you were talking about in terms of a gift to the society, because we're not going to get through all this in any way intact if we don't open up our hearts and feelings as well.
Right.
So I don't know if that makes any sense, but to me that's the link there.
We're going to stumble through this, I think. That's what's going to happen. We don't have a public health system in the United States that lends itself to easy turning on a dime sort of thing. And the days of turning on a dime were 10 years ago, not today. There's no dime anymore to turn on.
Because we're here. We're here.
Right. And we're hearing overwhelming numbers that even if the existing psychologists were all born again, or we had pods to put under their bed to make them elder care authorities, they don't have the life experience. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. This conversation should have come 20 years ago. Your program should have come 20 years ago, so that it would be mature now. And it's mature at just the time when the need is the greatest, when it's growing.
My apologies.
You know, it's like giving swimming lessons when the boat is sinking. It's pretty late in the game to give people swimming lessons.
I was going to maybe give Vincent. Vincent, you've been with us now for almost 3 years. So, what? Because you're a psychologist.
Well, actually, it was great. But anyway, actually, I was going to say in my.
We won't tell the board you called yourself a psychologist.
That's the thing, right? Technically, you can't until you have a license. It's this whole thing. I was actually thinking about that, and I disagree. I actually find that the work is quite cerebrally challenging, and it's cerebrally challenging in the fact that it's a lot easier for someone to use a road. So for any other sort of work that we have in this field, there's a roadmap for it. There's a conceptualization that you can consult. There's an orientation that you can find to get some direction in terms of where you go. You do X, Y, and Z with this person. There's a common interpretation for this. But with this work, it's incredibly challenging because we can't necessarily rely on what we've become so reliant on. We need the challenges in taking everything, all the thinking that we have up here, and then finding some way to apply it in basically, almost virgin, unexplored territory. So, I mean, I guess it's whenever I'm telling people about the work at this place, particularly when it's for interviews or recruiting new people, one thing I always say is that the good thing about work here is that it really challenges you to have to leave your comfort zone in the box in which we kind of exist in our identities and have to try and find these creative ways of applying what we know to the population of people that we're working with. So I wanted to comment on that, and I actually had a question. So the three of you sitting up here, having been working on this for a long time and kind of advocating for this, we're a bunch of younger mental health professionals that are just in various stages of getting into the field. So what advice do you have for us in a way that we can kind of contribute to, I guess, supporting this growing need that's coming up? I mean, what is it that we as young professionals can kind of add to help out? If that makes sense.
You could agitate more for more programs like he runs. This should be, when it's going to be 1/3 of the population has these psychological issues, we should be spending 1/3 of our curriculum helping people who are going to be helpers for this 1/3, giving them constructs. I think you could do that.
Yeah, and I was thinking, using so much of what Al is writing about and what you were just mentioning, Richard, to get into the academic institutions and change the curricula there. Because that we don't have, I think, Jacob, isn't it not true? Just right now they're beginning to require a class on elder psychology. Is that true now?
Yes, at a lot of schools it's very biologically based. It
Right.
doesn't provide a lot in the way of interventions and that.
So it's more the biology of aging.
Yeah.
And how that,
Yeah.
so that paradigm, yeah.
Also, they just recently made it a requirement to take a CEU course in long-term aging for licensure, but still, once again, it's a CEU course online, so.
And it's biological.
Yeah.
And it's biological,
I'll say
right.
2 quick things before we jump to the back. Number one, just this Guru project, like Richard and Nader said, seeing the people that you support as your teachers in a way. Saying, what is this person teaching me right now? Even if the person is doing something you might consider, counterproductive, what are they teaching me about their situation, about their experience, and what's going on? And being open to being the student as well as the therapist. And the other part is that you can start now. Yeah, it's too bad that Nader was taking samba lessons 20 years ago instead of doing this project, you know, and being irresponsible like that. But, you know, the Zen master says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. And the nice thing is that you are a lot younger, and we're going to run out of energy one of these days. And so we need reinforcements. We need people to broaden the message and to take the core of what we say and develop it and evolve it even further and to take it to the next level. So that's, you are the ideally positioned group because you're getting this experience that nobody else I've seen in this country has gotten anywhere. And I think it's great. Yes, sir.
Dr. Clark?
Taylor.
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 Yeah.
Taylor, I'm sorry. You talked about your frustration a little earlier around what you perceive as your loss of abilities and your inability to do some of the things that you would like to do. How do you deal with that frustration?
Sometimes I tear up. Sometimes I just get quiet. My family knows that something is happening to me or with me cognitively. If I get quiet all of a sudden, I don't know, I just sort of, I think what makes me slightly different from many people who have dementia is I've just accepted it. It just is. It's a fact of my life. So when I bump into it, sometimes I'm surprised because you don't live in dementia every second of your life. And sometimes I'm frustrated. I guess that's how I deal with it. I just say, well, that's the way it is. You know, I try to problem solve. I think a lot of people with dementia don't try to problem solve because they bought into the fact that they're dying. And unfortunately now that's a very, it's a popular way of raising funds for dementia research. Is to remind people that you'll die of this. Everyone who has dementia is going to die, you know.
Or we're all going to die whether we have dementia.
Well, you can say that, but we're talking about dementia. Yeah.
But,
Absolutely don't talk
so, Dr. Taylor, as a clinician with a very storied history and stuff like that, how would you talk to a beginning clinician as myself and how to deal with people such as you? How would you guide me? Especially around your frustrations and stuff, which we see in a lot of our community as far as people with forgetfulness. We see that acting up. We see that frustration. And I understand it's an unmet need. You've articulated your unmet need. A lot of times we don't understand a lot of the unmet needs in our community. But if you're, say, in a professorship and you're talking to me as a beginning clinician, how would you inform me how to deal with you with your frustration?
Well, I would tell people to forget everything you've learned in graduate school and become an active listener. Because there's nothing to remember from graduate school that's going to help you in here. But active listening will. You'll have to teach yourself, but it will be easy to teach yourself because now we're kind of on the same plane. We're talking about emotions. We're talking about behavior meaning things that other people don't appreciate. You all have those moments. You all get mad at your husbands or wives and they say, you can't be mad at me about that. You know, well, I am, damn it. We all have these moments. It's not that people with dementia experience feelings or have thoughts that have never happened in human history except to people who have dementia. It's just that we have fragments of them and they come and go and our attention is not always in our control. When I was first diagnosed and I wrote my book, I wrote about memory. I saw my brain as like a 10-story building. And the elevator, I perceived something, and then the elevator would rush up and down the store. And then some little guy runs down the hall to the room where you got this memory. And you open the door, and my God, the room is a mess. All the files are on the floor. You can't, you know, why did we let this happen? And I go to the wrong door sometimes. That's how I saw memory. And to some extent, that's a common understanding of memory. It's a file in your head. And what happens with people with dementia is they lose the card file. They don't have a Google that works real well. Well, we know from brain science now that memories are not files. Memories are a scrap of paper here and a big piece of paper over here and a big emotional paper with a lot of ink on it back here. And what happens is it goes through to your hippocampus, it goes through a couple of neural networks on the way to your hippocampus, and then your hippocampus decides how it's going to put it together again. But we have this simplistic belief that, well, you're forgetting, or you can't remember, when in reality it's a much more complicated neurological problem, and therefore it's a complicated psychological problem, and we don't understand how that works. We don't know how you balance emotions with rational evidence, because some people are much better at that don't have dementia, and some people are god-awful at it that don't have dementia. So we don't know enough about the process to talk about it. We don't even have theories of how it works, because I believe it's so you know, we're using a computer to understand a computer, and there are inherent limitations to that. And there's no money in it, so there's almost no money spent on psychosocial research when it comes to dementia. There are billions spent on finding a cure for dementia when we can't even define what the hell it is scientifically. We don't know what the moment was when I didn't have dementia and what happened between then and the moment when I do have dementia. Because if we're going to cure something, we've got to intervene in that moment. But we don't have a clue about, well, they think they have a clue about it, but it hasn't proven itself out. So it's very hard for us to be biopsychologists when we're dealing with dementia, because they're just not the evidence base. I can't remember what the question was, but
That's how you do. You've answered it pretty well.
okay.
So maybe I can take that moment and just go into that bizarre explanation I was going to give you, because Richard's comments there were a perfect lead-in. And this brings me back to my initial comments about terminology and why terminology is so important. So let me just show you what as I said, I believe that most things that are labeled hallucinations, delusions, are mislabeled when it relates to people, you know, with cognitive change. And this is very radically different. Just about every neurologist or psychiatrist in the country will say that's not true. All I can tell you is I'm right and they're wrong. But so this is how I take what Richard says and look at this differently. And I want to take you to that old Wheel of Fortune game, okay? Now suppose we're playing Wheel of Fortune, all right? And we have this thing up here, 3 words, and it's a thing. You all know how to play Wheel of Fortune, right? And they fill in a few letters. We get an S here, we get an OF here, we get an L there, we get a Y, okay? Now it's my turn, I'm on TV, there's 1 billion people watching me. I've got the timer running, and they say, can you solve the puzzle? Okay? I have missing information, okay? Now maybe they gave you a little clue down below for the TV audience. Statue of Liberty, okay? Cool, so you know what it is. You know the answer. But I got 5 seconds, my mind's going in a lot of different directions, I'm missing these letters. So I say, is it states of lunacy? Is it stacks of laundry? Now people smile, they chuckle because you know the answer, and it sounds bizarre what I'm saying. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to fill in missing information. So what Richard says is he has a problem with retrieval of information. So when Richard is asked a question about what's going on, he may have missing letters. And his mind isn't gone, it's working overtime, trying to fill in those missing parts and put them in. And sometimes he gets it, and sometimes he comes up with a different answer than what we have. Okay? Now, if I'm saying stacks of laundry, and you give me Seroquel, do you think that will help me solve the problem? This is not a delusion or a hallucination. This is me taking the limited information I can retrieve and trying to make sense of the world around me. Antipsychotics don't work. And if you label this a delusion or a hallucination, you are fast-tracking that person to be put on antipsychotics because you're using psychiatric terminology. And that's why I think it's so dangerous to use these words, because it takes you down this road to treating things that cannot be treated that way. When you understand that people are just working with Wheel of Fortune, then it gives you a different way of looking at it.
Beautiful.
Does that make sense to you? The guy who wanted to run it by?
That is me. I could have said that earlier.
Oh, well, there we go. Glad to hear. I put that in the new book chapter, and I was afraid they rejected it as just being nuts, but they actually liked it. So.
Because when you label something a hallucination, you are essentially saying it's not true.
Yeah.
Right.
You're having a perception of something that's not true.
Yeah.
When you say, I'm going to play along with you, you're reinforcing the fact that it's not true, and you're just making this a game, that's all. When actually, I believe it's true. I mean, this is the proof that we still have a functioning brain, because it's always trying to figure out what's going on around me. It can't turn itself off. And maybe cockroaches came to my brain when I looked up at this. And I have trouble changing my focus of attention, controlling it. So I can, if I look hard enough, I can see those all over the room here, for heaven's sakes. And you walk out in the hall with a smirk on your face and say, he thinks there's cockroaches in that room. Without saying, well, he got most of it right, but for some reason, he arbitrarily fixated on cockroaches as the visual image of this, and now he's just filling in, his brain is filling in the cockroach poo that's on the floor and the smell of them and all that other stuff. Oh, I believe that 100%. I believe this 100%.
You know, early in my nursing home career, I was supporting a gentleman in my first nursing home job who had dementia. He had Parkinsonism. He probably, in retrospect, had what we would call dementia with Lewy bodies. But at that time, you know, we didn't necessarily identify it that way. But because he was stiff and Parkinsonian in his appearance, we had him on some anti-Parkinson medicine, and we were slowly increasing the dose every couple of weeks to see if we could get him more mobile. But knowing that the Cinemet, the dopaminergic drugs, are probably the most hallucinogenic drugs that we prescribe. And so I'm watching him to make sure I don't give him too much. And sure enough, I got the call one day that he was seeing bugs on the wall of the room. And most of the time, I would have either cut the dose down or maybe added an antipsychotic back then in the early 90s. But I decided to go see him, and I learned a lesson about hallucinations. I went in, he was this old German guy, and in my mind, I'm thinking he was a prisoner of war during World War II. His wife is living with forgetfulness on a different floor. He's always wondering where she is. He probably had some sort of post-traumatic stress. You know, he's on this drug, and I finally said, you know, just stop thinking. Just go in and talk to the guy. So I went in and I said, Willie, I understand that you're having a problem with bugs in your room. He says, that's right, doctor. And I said, well, tell me, what did they look like? And he sits there and he says, well, they kind of look like, and he says, well, like that. And I turned around, the cockroach ran across the room. So they were doing renovations, and the jackhammers were driving the insects out of the walls. And so my first rule of hallucinations is make sure that there really aren't bugs on there, because sometimes there are. And so I learned a lesson. So whenever you think someone's seeing something you don't think is there, always try to see them yourself. Don't take anyone's word for it, because we use these labels. See them in the place at the time of day when they saw it, because then you might understand how their perception of a shadow, of a reflection off the window, might lead them to see something that might get incorrectly labeled.
We actually have a case, Vincent, you remember? That case of a resident here who looked like a hippie, a really nice leftover hippie from the Hague. And leftover hippie.
I've been down there, they're still there.
And
There's one.
There is one. Yes, that's right.
She's crawling up the wall.
And she insisted that she had like $1 million in her bank, and she wanted to go and check on her bank account. And here she is with Kaiser, who basically immediately puts her on antipsychotics, because obviously she's delusional. right? This woman definitely doesn't have $1 million in the bank or whatever, right? So, and then we are trying to figure out how do we, because she keeps insisting on that, and I'm saying, well, we should obviously go down to San Jose and check on her bank, and she couldn't check on her bank because she didn't have a bank card. So I did, of course, broke all the rules of internship laws, and then took a student down and her, and went, got her card. She went to the bank. She had $1 million in the bank.
Wow.
And we drove back, and Kaiser took her off antipsychotics and said, "Oh, we can take care of her very well now."
This is also a lesson about not trusting necessarily the files and charting of managed healthcare places, because they also said that she suffered from postpartum depression, and she said, "I've never been pregnant in my life." So,
It's wild, it's wild.
Wow.
so yes, you know, look at everything and really, really just make sure things are as people say.
I'll give you another example of how dangerous this can be. I have a friend in Rochester who works for a law firm that occasionally, that works often defending nursing homes against liability suits. And about once every year or two, she'll send me a chart to give an expert opinion on whether the plaintiff has a case, whether they should defend it. So I looked through the chart. And they sent me one of a woman who had died, and she had a lot of complications. And one of the problems that I saw close to her death was that she had been on risperidone, an antipsychotic. And it looked like she'd been out for quite a long time. And I was concerned because some of the things that led to her illness, dehydration, those types of things, could have been exacerbated or caused by the antipsychotic, in which case there might have been some liability there. So I started kind of reading about her transfer to the hospital, eventual death, and I'm trying to figure out why she has this antipsychotic. And I went to the last 60-day routine note, and it said this is a 91-year-old woman with dementia and hallucinations. And but it didn't say what they were. So I started going backward through the chart. 60 days, 91-year-old woman with dementia and hallucinations. Went back after a year, it said a 90-year-old woman, then an 89-year-old woman. And the nurse's notes, nothing. And I finally got back 2.5, almost 3 years back in the chart. The woman had made one comment in the nursing note, which probably was a misinterpretation of something. Did not sound delusional, and she was on 3 years of risperidone, and the doctors just copied that diagnosis from note to note, even though she never showed any other signs. And this could have led to her death. So it's
So
pretty
please be
powerful.
careful what you say.
Language is important.
Yeah. So don't make any silly comments from now on. You're gonna write that down.
What I like to say is never diagnose, never label, at least in your descriptions. You know, just say what you hear, say what you see. Don't try to give it, so don't say she was hallucinating. Say she told me that she was sitting here at this time and she saw this. That way you're open to saying, what could that be? You haven't given it a label that makes us all think that it's one thing.
So true phenomenology, that's what we're talking about. Very nicely said. All right, it's 2 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming. We
Thanks,
now,
everybody.
for those who have time,